Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, August 2nd, 2023. The U.S. Capitol Police get a 911 call reporting an active shooter near the U.S. Senate office buildings, which leads to a lockdown and a search, but no active shooter is found. We'll get the latest from the Capitol Police Chief Thomas Manger. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen calls Fitch Ratings' downgrade of the U.S. government credit rating arbitrary. We'll hear from the Secretary and a Fitch analyst and talk with a Wall Street Journal economics reporter, Andy Duehren. IRS Commissioner Daniel Werfel talks about plans for the IRS to reduce its handling of paper documents and what going digital could mean for reduced costs and better consumer service. Former President Donald Trump will be arraigned in Washington, D.C. on Thursday on the latest criminal indictment he's facing, the federal charges that he illegally tried to stay in power despite his loss in the 2020 presidential election. We'll check in with a law professor about the timing of the trial versus the classified documents case he's facing in Florida. And also, a lawyer for Donald Trump will discuss whether he will seek to move the election interference case out of D.C. State Department discusses a new Chinese counter-espionage law that encourages average Chinese citizens to report suspicious activity. Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaks to young African leaders studying in the U.S. as part of a U.S. government program. And in Minnesota, House Agriculture Committee listening session on the 5-year Farm Bill reauthorization, giving local farmers and ranchers an opportunity to have input on programs and policies important to them. Washington Post reported mid-afternoon police are searching Senate office buildings after a 911 call reported an active shooter at the U.S. Capitol, but so far officers have found no evidence that a shooting occurred. The U.S. Capitol Police posted about the incident shortly before 3 p.m., saying officers were searching in and around the Senate office buildings in response to a concerning 911 call, and advising people inside to shelter in place because the report had been about a possible active shooter. Staffers could be seen emerging from the Dirksen Senate office building with their hands up. That was from the Washington Post. At 4 p.m. Eastern, the U.S. Capitol Police Chief Thomas Manger spoke to reporters and gave the all-clear.
At 2:30 this afternoon, MPD got a call, a 911 call, saying that there was an active shooter in the Hart building on the Senate side of the Capitol. We responded within seconds. We had a group there, a group of officers there. We have been training for active shooters for the last couple of years, and we've been training inside these office buildings. So it was very quickly, we had a group of about 20 officers who started going floor to floor through that building. Within a few minutes more, we got additional calls, but I think these calls were based on some of the staffers and other people that are here saying, hey, I heard about an active shooter, and so they were calling friends, family members who were then calling 911 again. So I think we have really, this all started with one call that Metropolitan Police got at 2:30. Right now we have close to 200 police officers going floor to floor through all 3 Senate office buildings. We've actually cleared one of the buildings. The other 2 are nearly clear. We gave an order very quickly for the staff to shelter in place as we were going door to door to check each office building. And once we would get to the office building, we go inside the office building, check all the people there, all the rooms. Some of the people were asking if they could leave, so they were able to leave. But the shelter-in-place order is still in place for those folks that are still there. But we weren't stopping people from leaving. We are stopping people from getting back in the building at this point. Again, we've had the advantage of having trained for this over the last couple of years, and we had a very quick response. But so far, nothing. We found nothing concerning. We've got nobody that actually heard shots, and certainly no victims. As we've gone through the building, no one has said that they've seen anything. The original lookout was for a heavyset Hispanic male wearing body armor. But again, no one's actually, we get no other information, no confirmation of that.
All the buildings are clear, just got confirmation.
All right. So now all three Senate office buildings have been cleared.
Thomas Manger, the U.S. Capitol Police Chief, speaking with reporters this afternoon. Now to the Fitch Ratings, one of the big three credit rating companies downgrading the U.S. government's credit rating from AAA to AA+, citing a steady deterioration in standards of governance over the last 20 years and repeated debt limit political standoffs and last-minute resolutions. When Fitch announced the downgrade Tuesday night, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen put out a written statement saying she strongly disagreed, called the move arbitrary, and said the American economy is fundamentally strong. Secretary Yellen spoke about it again today.
Before I begin, I'd like to speak about the recent decision by Fitch Ratings to downgrade the U.S. credit rating. Over the past few years, the American economy has seen an historic recovery from the depths of the pandemic downturn. Over 13 million new jobs have been created since January 2021. Our unemployment rate stands at 3.6%, near historic lows. Overall annual inflation has declined every month for the past year, and our economy continues to grow. In the longer term, the United States remains the world's largest, most dynamic, and most innovative economy, with the strongest financial system in the world. Fitch's decision is puzzling in light of the economic strength we see in the United States. I strongly disagree with Fitch's decision, and I believe it is entirely unwarranted. Its flawed assessment is based on outdated data and fails to reflect improvements across a range of indicators, including those related to governance, that we've seen over the past 2.5 years. Despite the gridlock, we've seen both parties come together to pass legislation to resolve the debt limit, as well as to make historic investments in our infrastructure and American competitiveness. Fiscal responsibility is a priority for President Biden and me. Earlier this year, the president signed debt limit legislation that included over $1 trillion in deficit reduction. His budget would also improve the fiscal outlook by reducing the deficit by $2.6 trillion over the next 10 years. Today, we're here to speak about an IRS modernization project launched this time last year that will reduce our deficit by hundreds of billions of dollars over the next decade by ensuring that the IRS has the resources it needs to enforce against wealthy taxpayers and large corporations that have not paid the taxes they owe. At the end of the day, Fitch's decision does not change what all of us already know, that Treasury securities remain the world's preeminent, safe, and liquid asset, and that the American economy is fundamentally strong.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen at an IRS office in McLean, Virginia. As she mentioned, it was an event that was mostly about modernizing the IRS. We'll have more on that later in Washington today. Richard Francis of Fitch Ratings, co-head of their America's Sovereign Ratings, was on CNBC today defending the decision to lower the U.S. credit rating.
This is a steady deterioration that we've seen in some of the key metrics for the United States for a number of years. Debt to GDP in 2007, general government debt was less than 60%, and now it's 113%. So there's been a clear deterioration. Furthermore, we're expecting fiscal deficits to rise over the next 3 years, and we expect debt to continue to rise over the next 3 years. And furthermore, because of the higher interest rates and the higher stock of debt, we're now seeing the interest burden rise pretty fast, actually, in the case of the United States. So the underlying numbers are, especially on the fiscal and debt side, are quite negative.
When it comes to the argument about governance and responsibility, government responsibility, why not? I know you referenced January 6th as part of this call. Why not do this a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, like the debt and the fiscal burden, we've seen a pretty steady deterioration in governance over the last couple of decades. And I think that you can highlight a few key elements. One would be the January 6th, but secondly, I think importantly for us is the constant brinkmanship surrounding the debt ceiling debate. The fact that the government, both sides, Republicans and Democrats, haven't been able to come up with kind of meaningful long-term solutions to deal with growing fiscal issues, especially around entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare. I mean, I think these are the type of things that highlight the importance of governments and also the inability of the government and both parties to come up with some kind of solution.
Richard Francis of Fitch Ratings on CNBC. Andy Duehren, Wall Street Journal economics reporter, has been tracking Fitch's downgrade of the U.S. credit rating and joins us now by phone. Thank you so much for being with us. What will the impact be of this decision?
So that's a little less than clear. It's possible that this credit rating change doesn't really have much of an impact. Investors have so far shown no sign of reconsidering their desire to hold U.S. Treasuries as a result of this. Treasuries are a safe haven asset all around the world, and they're held by investors everywhere. It's the largest and most liquid asset in the world, and for those structural reasons, people like to own Treasuries. And so far, people seem to keep believing in that more than they believe in Fitch's downgrade.
What reasons did Fitch cite in making this decision?
So Fitch had a few different reasons for this. One was their views on the fiscal outlook in the United States. The deficit is growing this year. Debt burdens are continuing to rise in the U.S., becoming more expensive for the U.S. to pay back its debt, and so that's one reason why. Another major reason is the ongoing or the semi-regular impasses that happen in Washington over raising the debt limit. Obviously, we just went through that earlier this year, where there's this big political battle in Washington over whether the debt limit should be raised, and that calls into question whether or not the U.S. will make good on its obligations to bondholders. So that's another reason. And then the third reason, and it's related to the second one, is just broader political issues in Washington, governance issues, as Fitch put it. So the broader political dysfunction in Washington. One thing that Fitch officials brought up with the Biden administration was the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And so there's a sense too that polarization in Washington is getting so serious that its ability to tackle economic policy issues, including the debt limit and including the deficit and the debt, is compromised.
On that subject of disagreements between the parties, the reaction to the downgrade has been for one party to blame the other and vice versa. For instance, I'll just read you some of the statements. Congressman Bob Good, Republican of Virginia, writing, all Democrats and those Republicans who talk about fiscal responsibility but voted for the unlimited debt ceiling increase that locked in Biden's big spending own this credit rating downgrade. And Congressman Gerald Connolly, Democrat from Virginia, said Fitch's downgrade is a direct result of MAGA policies. Rooting for shutdowns and threatening default is no way to run a government. So what does it say that Fitch says that the parties can't get along, that's why we're downgrading, and then they blame each other?
I think you could certainly say that goes right to Fitch's point about all of this. I mean, the parties are deeply dug in when it comes to fiscal policies. I mean, I think some it's reasonable to say, and people in the Biden administration certainly have made this argument that despite a lot of the rhetoric, some of that rhetoric has existed for a long time, for decades, Republicans and Democrats have, at the end of the day, always come together to raise the debt limit. They like to talk and argue with each other, but that hasn't yet sent the U.S. off the cliff with the debt limit. And so certainly, it's a reminder of the governance issues that Fitch raises, but there's room for disagreement there in terms of whether that type of language is actually indicative of a broader inability for the U.S. to pay its bills.
We're talking with Andy Duehren, reporter with the Wall Street Journal. What will it take for the U.S. to regain the AAA rating from Fitch?
So I'm not sure exactly, if there are specific fiscal policy changes that Fitch would say would meet its standards for a AAA rating again. I mean, certainly cutting taxes or raising taxes or cutting spending could move the U.S. in a direction that improves its fiscal outlook. Potentially, obviously, toning down some of the political rhetoric in Washington could maybe help because, given that those are some of the issues that Fitch focused on. But, it's worth noting that S&P downgraded the U.S. in 2011 in a similar way after a debt limit impasse, and that S&P has not changed that rating since then. So it's possible that this is a rating that will stick for the long term for the United States.
And finally, can you explain how it is that there are private rating companies that are rating the federal government? What's the relationship there?
Yeah, so some of these rating firms analyze and rate and provide grades for all sorts of debt, whether it's debt that's offered by the U.S. government or by corporate borrowers or other governments around the world. And as a guide for investors, they will say, oh, we think that this borrower is very likely to pay back this money or is maybe less likely. And that has a big determination, or those ratings can have a big determination in deciding the rates that investors demand, the interest rates that investors demand to lend certain borrowers money. I mean, it is an interesting point, though, with the U.S. government, because the U.S. government debt is the largest and most liquid asset in the world, and because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, there is a sense that the normal rules of gravity maybe don't apply in the same way to the U.S. government. I mean, typically, if there were a rating downgrade, creditworthiness downgrade for a borrower, that would have an impact on how investors view that borrower. But when the borrower is the United States government and U.S. government debt is so deeply baked into how the entire global financial system is structured, there's not necessarily as much recourse for investors to say, oh, I can go park my money somewhere else, when in a lot of ways this is the place where you park your money. So it's a complicated question when it comes to the U.S. government, or a little bit more complicated, but in general, these are firms that evaluate borrowers for the benefit of investors and provide a kind of a rubric or a guide for whether somebody is creditworthy or not.
Andy Duehren, Wall Street Journal economics reporter. Find his stories at WSJ.com and on Twitter, or X, A. Duehren. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Wall Street reaction today: the Dow down 348, NASDAQ down 310, S&P down 63. A press release from the IRS today is titled IRS Launches Paperless Processing Initiative. It reads, taxpayers will have the option to go paperless for IRS correspondence by the 2024 filing season, and the IRS will achieve paperless processing for all tax returns by filing season 2025. IRS Paperless Processing Initiative, it says, will eliminate up to 200 million pieces of paper annually, cut processing times in half, and expedite refunds by several weeks. The IRS Commissioner Daniel Werfel spoke about this today at the IRS office in McLean, Virginia, across the river from Washington, D.C.
The amount of paper still being used inside the IRS often feels more like the 1970s and the 1980s than the 21st century. And during the pandemic, you all saw the photos of the IRS cafeteria in our Austin campus with racks and racks of paper absolutely filling a room not normally used for storage. Tens of millions of pieces of paper that require manual processing flood our campuses and offices. It's time to ensure that no cafeteria in the IRS ever looks like that again. As the taxpayer advocate who is here today has noted, paper is the agency's kryptonite. When our operations are flooded with paper, we are slower and more prone to errors. To counter that kryptonite, there are emerging technologies that will make it possible for us to convert the oceans of paper that arrive at our doors into a digital format before it ever leaves our mailroom. Specifically, it is now our goal that by the 2025 filing season, the IRS will achieve paperless processing, which means digitizing all paper filed returns as soon as they are received. Achieving this milestone will enable up to 76 million paper documents to be processed digitally every year. And more immediately, for the 2024 filing season, we are giving taxpayers new tools that will help them go paperless should they choose. We are launching web-based solutions for the upcoming filing season that will allow virtually all correspondence to be uploaded by taxpayers rather than mailed in. Being able to digitally submit their correspondence and responses and other paper, that means taxpayers will have the potential to digitally submit up to 125 million paper documents each year. In addition, we will be adding more non-tax forms in digital mobile-friendly formats that will make it easier for taxpayers to complete and submit. All of this means the IRS will improve service, cutting internal process times, and even speeding refund delivery for taxpayers that are still choosing to submit a paper 1040. A digital IRS, rather than a paper IRS, is exactly what was intended when Congress provided new funds under the Inflation Reduction Act.
The IRS Commissioner Daniel Werfel in McLean, Virginia today. The IRS also says that going digital will reduce storage costs and that the IRS has more than 1 billion historical documents, which cost $40 million per year to store. Former President Donald Trump is scheduled to be arraigned at the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. on Thursday after being indicted yesterday over alleged efforts to overturn his defeat in the 2020 presidential election. He'll appear before a magistrate judge to hear the charges against him. There are 4 counts, and enter a plea, and there may also be some discussion about procedure and future court dates. We spoke with Kimberly Whaley, a former Assistant U.S. Attorney, now a University of Baltimore law professor, also an ABC News legal contributor, about the U.S. District Judge who will be handling this case, Tanya Chutkan, and also the comparison of this election interference case in Washington and the classified documents criminal case that Donald Trump is facing in Florida.
This judge has experience as a criminal defense lawyer in private practice, so that might be a good thing for the former president in terms of her being presumably very careful about protecting his constitutional rights, although I think any federal judge would do that. The jury's not going to be as pro-Trump, where Judge Cannon in Florida has set the trial. The numbers in terms of voters from which they will pull the jury pool are very solidly voted for Trump in the last election. So that is a benefit to the president because in order to get a conviction in both of these cases, there needs to be a unanimous jury. If one juror decides that they are loyal to the president, no matter what, then that would be a hung jury and he would not be convicted. The government could certainly do it a second time, but I think given the stakes, I would be astonished if a prosecutor, if there was not a victory for the government in one of these cases, would try to go at it a second time. I think the D.C. jury is more democratically leaning and is probably going to be a steeper climb for the defense. It's just in terms of persuading enough jurors either to hang the jury or to acquit, which of course would be the best thing for Donald Trump. That is, everybody votes that the government doesn't have enough evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to justify a conviction.
What about the timing of when this latest case will be tried? Could it bump that Florida case, or could they happen concurrently? Does the special counsel's office have the ability to do that?
Well, hard to know how many lawyers and prosecutors are on his various teams. I don't think it's the same team just because these are complex cases, thousands of documents and witnesses, particularly in the January 6th case. And so the same group of lawyers would not be able to manage both cases at the same time. So I don't think it'll be a resources problem for the government. There's no requirement that cases run concurrently. That being said, the judges are sensitive to the defendant's needs, are sensitive to the defense team's needs, and also are respectful of the other judges' calendars. So I think it would be probably not feasible to assume that the judges would sort of have back-to-back trials going on. Of course, they can't be at the same time because Donald Trump can't be in two states at the same time. But so I suspect that one will come after the other. At this point, the Florida one is in May. I think in both cases, we're probably going to see Donald Trump's lawyers file motions challenging various legal issues, and those alone can justify delays in trial dates.
The former president is expected in D.C. tomorrow to respond to this indictment. Just remind us what happens when he appears in court tomorrow?
Well, here, like we've seen the last two times, I mean, there'll be an official process of arresting him and booking him. I mean, this will all be done, with great respect and kid gloves, like it should be, because he's a former president. And then he will enter a plea of presumably not guilty before the trial court.
Kimberly Whaley, University of Baltimore law professor, former Assistant U.S. Attorney, and an ABC News legal contributor, joining C-SPAN on this morning's Washington Journal program. John Lauro is one of the attorneys for Donald Trump in this case, was interviewed on several TV news programs this morning. On CBS Mornings, he was asked if Donald Trump will attend Thursday's arraignment in person, as he does have the option of taking part remotely by video.
Is the former president planning to appear in court on Thursday in Washington?
That's really up to the Secret Service and the United States Marshal Service. He's required to appear either virtually or in person on Thursday, and he'll do that.
Does he want to be there in person?
It really depends on the security arrangements, so that's not in our control. But what the president wants to do is absolutely defend himself on these baseless charges. This is the first time that political speech has been criminalized in the history of the United States. It's the first time where a current president is using the criminal process to attack a former president on policy issues. We are in a constitutional abyss right now. We've never seen this in 40 years as a defense lawyer. I've never seen this. But the president wants his day in court. But most importantly, he wants to get to the truth, which we will do in this case.
John Lauro is an attorney for former President Donald Trump in this case concerning alleged election interference in the 2020 presidential election. John Lauro on CBS Morning program this morning. He was also asked about whether the legal team will be seeking to move the trial out of Washington, D.C.
This is a federal court in Washington.
Yes.
It's going to require a jury. That's a city that voted overwhelmingly against the former president. Would you seek a venue change?
Absolutely. That's one of
Where
the
do you
first
want it to
things
go
we're
instead?
do. Well, there's other options. I mean, there's certainly West Virginia, which is close by. There's other areas of the country.
West Virginia?
Absolutely. It's very in close proximity to D.C.
Which is like the political opposite of Washington, D.C.
Well,
you think you'll get a fair trial there?
It's much more diverse than Washington, D.C., which I think went 95% for Mr. Biden.
One other thing.
Or there's other places. But the bottom line is, the president, like everyone sitting in this room, is entitled to a fair trial. And we're going to get that.
John Lauro, attorney for former President Trump, on CBS this morning. A USA Today article reads, a day before Donald Trump's arraignment, the proverbial calm before the political storm reigned outside the E. Barrett Prettyman Courthouse in the heart of Washington, D.C., while television production trucks lined the street at the junction of Pennsylvania Avenue and Constitution Avenue and pointed cameras at the front of the courthouse. The only noise included usual horn honking and sirens from D.C. traffic, as well as the voices of television correspondents doing occasional stand-ups. Also spotted security personnel. Wary of trouble, several Federal Protective Service officers, the law enforcement agency of the Homeland Security Department, patrolled outside the courthouse. Some led a bomb-sniffing police dog around the exterior of the building. That from USA Today. The U.S. Capitol Police Chief Thomas Manger was asked today if his agency is ready.
Chief, are you worried about tomorrow at all?
We're prepared for tomorrow. We've been working with our partners from our partner agencies here, MPD, U.S. Park, Secret Service, and Federal Protection Service. We've all been working together in preparation for whenever, if the indictment in fact did happen. We've been talking about this for a couple of weeks now. So we've had a couple of phone calls today. So yeah, we're prepared for whatever might happen.
Thomas Manger, U.S. Capitol Police Chief, with reporters today. The arraignment of Donald Trump in Washington, D.C., scheduled for 4 p.m. Eastern on Thursday. We'll have coverage of the events on the C-SPAN networks. The Republican National Committee has released criteria for presidential candidates to be invited to the second Republican primary debate, and that criteria is tougher than for the first debate. The first debate is later this month, required a candidate to have at least 40,000 unique donors, including 200 or more from 20 or more states each, plus at least 1% registering in 3 national polls or 2 national polls and 2 early state polls. Also, requirement to sign a pledge that the candidate will support the eventual Republican presidential nominee. For the second debate in September, The requirements increased to 50,000 unique donors and at least 3% in one national poll and 3% in two polls in two early primary states. The Republican National Committee Chair Ronna McDaniel was interviewed on Fox News today.
The polling criteria, the threshold raises, right? So right now it's 1% in 3 national polls, then it goes to 3% in 2 national polls. And the small dollar fundraising from unique donors goes from 40,000 to 50,000. We should be stepping up the criteria. Once you get on that debate stage and you get in front of the American people, if you're not having momentum, if you're not showing growth in your campaign, then that's a problem. And we need to make sure that we are putting in front of the Republican primary voters the candidate who's going to take on Joe Biden. And I say this all the time, you know, you don't go to the Olympics unless you pass the prelims, right? This is the Olympic stage of the Republican Party primary, and there's going to be criteria that you have to meet to be on that stage.
Republican National Committee Chair Ronna McDaniel on Fox News talking about the second Republican presidential primary debate in September. The first debate is August 23rd in Milwaukee, and 7 candidates say that they have qualified for it already. Doug Burgum, Chris Christie, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, Tim Scott, and Donald Trump. Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. A few more headlines. The acting NIH director has announced that Dr. Gene Marazzo, currently the director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, will be the new head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, starting this fall, taking over for the former leader, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who retired at the end of 2022 after 40 years in the job. The position does not require Senate confirmation. And Robert Bowers, the shooter who killed 11 worshipers and wounded 6 more at the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, was sentenced to death by a federal jury. It's the first federal death penalty imposed under the Biden administration. The jury's decision had to be unanimous for a death sentence. Otherwise, it would have been life in prison without parole. Taiwan News reports the Chinese State Security Ministry stated that China should encourage its citizens to participate in counter-espionage activities, including by setting up avenues for people to report suspicious activity, as well as by praising and paying them. The Ministry of State Security, the major body overseeing foreign intelligence and anti-spying, stated in its first post on its WeChat account, which went live on Monday, that a system must be put in place that makes it normal for the general public to participate in counter-espionage. The call to popularize anti-spying work among the masses follows an expansion of China's counter-espionage law that took effect in July. That reporting from Taiwan News. The U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller was asked about it today.
I wanted to ask this on behalf of a colleague on China, which is what is the State Department's reaction to the Ministry of State Security's encouragement of Chinese citizens to assist in counter-espionage efforts? Are there concerns in this department that this could jeopardize the safety of American citizens or American business people operating in China, especially in light of the ambiguous counter-espionage law implemented in July?
We do have concerns over it. Certainly encouraging citizens to spy on each other is something that's of great concern. We are closely monitoring the implementation of China's new counter-espionage law, as we have been, which, as written, greatly expands the scope of what activities are considered espionage. In addition to being concerned about these new reports, we remain concerned about the risk of arbitrary arrest and detention in the PRC, as is reflected in our Level 3 travel advisory. And I will add that these are issues that the Secretary raised in his meetings with Chinese officials.
And have these concerns been raised more recently in meetings that have been subsequent to the Secretary's?
I will say we have raised our general concerns about the anti-espionage law in our meetings with Chinese officials. With respect to this new report, I think it just broke overnight, so I don't know that we've had any meetings with them with which we could raise it.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at his news conference. Associated Press reporting from Taiwan that Taiwan has detained an Army officer and several collaborators on suspicion of handing military secrets to China. The Defense Ministry said Wednesday that a lieutenant colonel and other defendants were suspected of having been recruited by China to leak national defense secrets and other information. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaking today in Washington at the Mandela Washington Fellowship Summit for Young African Leaders. It's a U.S. government program in which 700 sub-Saharan African fellows, 25 to 35 years old, come to the U.S., and up to 100 of them taking part in a 4-week professional development experience with private U.S. companies, NGOs, and state and local governments. Here's Secretary Blinken.
You all know these statistics very, very well, and it's important that more of my fellow citizens know them too. More than 60% of Africa's population is under the age of 25. By 2030, in just a few short years, 2 in every 5 people on our planet will be young and African. So, looking around this room today, I can tell, I know, that because of that fact, and because of all of you, that future can and will be very bright. We're committed. We're committed to working with young African leaders like you today and for years to come, so that together we have an opportunity to build a world that's a little bit more stable, a little bit more resilient, a little bit more prosperous for all. And as Liz said, sometimes change feels slow. Sometimes it feels like you're not making a difference, or you're not making the big strides that you imagine. But every step forward takes you closer and closer to the goal that you have. And as you know, as you're taking that journey, and at some point you stop along the way, you will be amazed at the distance you've traveled. You will be amazed at the difference that you're making. For me, that's a source of incredible pride, that we have some small part to play in the incredible things that you're doing. It really couldn't be any better than that.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken today in Washington at the Mandela Washington Fellowship Summit for Young African Leaders. An article at Politico reads, the U.S. government is preparing an order to evacuate most U.S. embassy personnel from Niger, according to 3 people familiar with internal deliberations. The West African country, which only recently transitioned to democracy and is a key recipient of U.S. security aid, is in the midst of a military coup. The article continues, the Biden administration is struggling with how to respond, including whether to formally declare the events a coup, because doing so could endanger its efforts to battle terrorism and give an opening for Russia to increase its influence in Africa. That from Politico. This is Washington Today. While Congress is on its August recess, some members are taking the opportunity to give constituents an opportunity for input on legislation that's going to be considered when the members return in September. The House Agriculture Committee held a listening session today in Redwood County, Minnesota, on the reauthorization of the Farm Bill, which comes up every 5 years. Congressman Glenn Thompson, Republican of Pennsylvania, is the committee chair.
The current Farm Bill is set to expire this year. Without a doubt, the most important part of the Farm Bill process is to hear from farmers, ranchers, foresters, producers, processors, the people of rural America, like all of you. So we know what's working, what's not, and where you need the most support. Now, there's a saying I learned BC, which either stand for before Congress or before children, that when it comes to public policy, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And so you all are at the table, and I'd like to thank my esteemed colleagues for joining me, all great agriculture advocates and champions. And we're ready to trade in our dress shoes for our work boots and get this done.
Congressman Glenn Thompson, Republican from Pennsylvania, today in Minnesota at the Agriculture Committee listening session at Farm Fest. He and Minnesota members of Congress, Brad Finstad and Michelle Fischbach, both Republican, Writing a piece in Ag Week that begins, Minnesota is more than just the land of 10,000 lakes. It is also the home to thousands of farms that grow, produce, and raise the food our country eats every day. As current and former members of the House Committee on Agriculture, we are committed to being leaders for American agriculture, which includes standing up for our hardworking producers, processors, ranchers, foresters, consumers, and every small business across the agriculture value chain. That from their piece in Ag Week. Here's a few of the citizens who gave testimony today in Minnesota, beginning with Bob Worth, president of Minnesota's Soybean Growers Association.
What I really want to talk, and it's going to be repeated many times, is crop insurance. This is going to be my third year of a drought. And if it wasn't for crop insurance, a lot of farmers like me probably would not be surviving. And I am really concerned about the younger generation farmers that do not have the working capital, do not have the net worth to survive this. And if we don't keep our young farmers back on the farm, or get them back on the farm, farming as we know it will be gone, because us old farmers are going to have to quit sometime. And so that's so important that we do have a great crop insurance. I think it can be improved. I know it can be improved so we can not have to worry about an ad hoc or anything like that. So this does not work as good as it should. So, and then for us in soybeans, we need a good trade program, because we need to export 6 out of every 10 rows out of the state of Minnesota. So it is important that we have a super trade program, increase our funding for our MAP and FMD. So this is stuff that really is important to all of us. The whole farm bill is really important, but these are two topics that are so important. So I want to thank you all for being here and listening to us. And, you know, we try to tell our story because we live it every day. Thank you very much.
Bob, thank you.
Thank you. Next up will be Lori Stevermer on deck, Nate Holgren, and in the hole is Brian Werner. So next we'll hear from Lori Stevermer, who's president-elect of the National Pork Producers Council.
Well, thank you, Chair Thompson, the rest of the members of Congress for being here today. And especially thank you to the Minnesota delegation for all the work that you do on behalf of Minnesota pig farmers. For those of you that may not be aware, Minnesota ranks number 2 in pork production. Our 3,000 farmers marketed 16 million pigs last year. So in addition to the economic activity that provides, our farmers are part of the fabric of our rural economy, which is very important. For this farm bill, 4 things I'd like to address today: trade, animal health, labor, and Proposition 12. Despite the challenges we faced this last year with some red ink, trade has been a bright spot for us. We exported $7.7 billion worth of pork, which is 25% of our production at $61 a head. All of that goes away and is shut down if we get a foreign animal disease like ASF. That's why disease prevention and preparedness is important, and funding in the Farm Bill for that 3-legged stool of our national lab network, disease preparedness, and the vaccine bank is very important, and continuing. If ASF comes, it doesn't just affect farmers, it affects corn, soybean, agribusiness, and consumers. So that's very important to us. Labor's a challenge. We know there's a labor shortage, and adjusting those H-2A visas so that those workers can stay year-round is important, because pork production happens year-round. Finally, Proposition 12 is a far-reaching piece of legislation from California. There should be no way that the people in California tell Minnesota pig farmers how to raise pigs. Our concern is the cost of Our concern is the cost of complacency, or the cost of to comply would cause small and medium farmers to have to leave the business and have more consolidation. The patchwork of regulations that could happen across 50 states would be hard for us. Appreciate your attention to this and all other matters. Thank you for being here.
Lori Stevermer, President-elect of the National Pork Producer Council's Executive Board, and you also heard from Bob Worth, President of Minnesota Soybean Growers Association, 2 of the participants at a listening session held by the U.S. House Agriculture Committee in Minnesota on this year's Farm Bill reauthorization. An article in Roll Call from July reads that House Democrats are considering how firmly to dig in on Farm Bill issues they care about, as they anticipate partisan fights over food stamps, climate change, and other matters as lawmakers approach the expiration of the current law. Congressman Benny Thompson, the chair of the House Agriculture and Nutrition Task Force that held its final forum on July 13th, said there are limits to how far the Democrats are willing to compromise as they seek to influence the bill and set farm policy for 5 years. The current law expires September 30th. That reporting from Roll Call. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about, sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.